I thank you that we can examine your word, that we can come together, Lord, that we could have some interesting discussions about the nature of how you created us. But Lord, let whatever these discussions, wherever they take us, let us turn back to you in worship and glory and honor and gratitude that you saw fit to create us and to seek us out. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, so in our discussions coming off of our last series, a handful of questions kind of came up that are worth exploring. Primarily, one of the first one is dealing with this, and really, most of it came out of this idea of when we were discussing Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism. What is the nature of the soul? How is sin transmitted? When does God save us? When do we respond to Him? Does He cause us to respond to Him? And all these kind of questions. So, over the next little while, we'll deal with the first question is, what is the origin of the soul? And so there's three positions on this. We'll cover that. I think Pastor Dave is going to come in and talk about kind of the nature of the human, where you got body, but then do we have soul and spirit, or do we have soul and spirit? And so he'll have that discussion probably next month. And then I want to come back in, and there's another discussion that I'd like to have on this idea of lapsarianism, and it has three prefixes, but in the end is like, when does God save us? And when does He pull us out of the muck and mire? And so we'll get to that eventually. All right? So, but today, let's talk about the origin of the soul. All right, so by way of introduction, the soul is the spiritual essence of the human being, and it, like the physical body, originates with the creative work of God. So we're going to bounce around the scriptures quite a bit, so please have your Bibles up and ready. Let's go first to Genesis 2, verse 7. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Actually, jump back to verse 5. So it's the beginning of the paragraph there. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground. Verse 6, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Verse 7, then the Lord formed the man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. In short, God is the one who created us. And I find it interesting that as we go through the days of creation, every act of creation by God was, let there be light, let there be creeping things, let the waters separate from the waters, let the water recede from the land. It was all spoken by command. It wasn't until verse 7 of chapter 2 we see that God works His creative work slightly differently. He says, then the Lord formed the man of the dust of the ground. That God quite literally got His hands dirty making humanity, that we are a unique and special aspect of creation. And we're the only creatures that can attest to that God came down and formed us and didn't just say, let human beings be, right? So it gives us a special relationship with God our Father. So the Hebrew word that is often used for soul is the term, we're going to do this a little bit. So we're going to have soul, and then we have some different words for spirit. And so, but soul, the Hebrew word for soul, let's see if I can write this correctly, is going to be nephesh, and yeah, there. So nephesh, you got a n, and then you get, so this first letter is an N sound, ne, and then you got a kind of a PH sound, a f, and then this weird looking W is sometimes an S or a sh sound. If you see the dot above it, it's a sh. And so it's nefesh, nefesh. And then these three little dots is an vowel. It's just kind of pointed. Because the Hebrew originally written, I think most of us know, there's no vowels, it's all consonants. And so when you look at really, really old Hebraic text, you just have to know the language well enough to know what vowels to place between. But some scholars along the way were very kind to those that would come after, and they started putting vowel points different ways. So we knew kind of what sound to make, whether it's an 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 o, or all those are vowels. So all those little dots below will end up being kind of the vowel pronounced. So the main term for Hebrew for the term soul is nefesh. Oops, already messing it up. So nefesh. Make sense so far? Okay. So but it's also the same word used for breath and for living creature. Because as the psalmist David wrote, we are a soul. The Lord calls us a soul. And sometimes, even in modern English today, I can't imagine how many souls just died. Right? That we, even in our language, we can't help but, we cannot separate, we can't help but to combine the idea of soul with the human, that the human has a soul. We are physical, and we are material and immaterial, or physical and spiritual innately. And so you can't have a human that does not have a nefesh, right? So the Genesis 2, go ahead. Correct.
And so
correct.
That's another way, in addition, to look at that.
And we have that in other languages, like another biblical reference. We see the hand of God or the finger of God. And is it just his hand or his finger that's operating? No, of course not. One, God is spirit. He doesn't really have a hand or finger. It's a metonymy that is saying that this is an act of God as a whole. We use it in English too. We talk about the long arm of the law. Right? Are we talking about someone like some sheriff with a very long arm that reaches out and grabs our shoulder? No, we're talking about law enforcement as a whole, right? So it gets muddled somewhere between metonymy, you take it apart to represent the whole, or somewhat of an allegory or an illusion or something along those lines. They all kind of get muddled together. But yeah, absolutely. Like, that's enough on that one. That's enough. I don't want to dig too deep. But yes, absolutely. So nefesh is soul, and that is generally as breath, a living thing, or soul, to call out the human, and describes the origin of the first human soul, as we saw in Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. The first human soul that was created was that of the man, Adam. Adam just means the man. Right? And Eve is the woman. Yes, sir? No. Oh, okay. And we have transliterated Adam and Eve into English by their sounds, and we get the names Adam and Eve. But originally, he's just the man and the woman. Do you know what Eve's name is in the Greek Old Testament in the Septuagint? Because it's not Eve. It's actually translated. It's Zoe. Life. All right, because she's the mother of life. That all of human life came through Eve. So if you look up the Greek Old translation of the Old Testament, when you see Adam and Eve, it's going to be Adam and Zoe. So it's kind of fun, right? Going on. So it says that God breathed into him, Adam's nostrils, the breath of life. And that breath of life is the nephesh. So throughout history, theologians have advanced basically three primary arguments or theories of the origin of the soul subsequent to Adam. So those that came after Adam. How did the rest of us receive a soul? So some theologians taught the soul was supernaturally created by God like Adam's was. And so we have, let's use a different color. We have one position, which we will address today, called creationism. This is not the creationism of the world, of the universe, and all that exists. This is, when we're dealing in this context, dealing with the soul, creationism argues that the soul is uniquely created by God at conception or somewhere near conception for each human being, right? So it's talking that. So each human being has a newly created soul, all right? So that's that position. Others have taught the soul is created through the natural process of reproduction. There's a propagation of the natural propagation of having children. That the soul, just as the body is a combination of the material parts of mom and dad, that our souls are the combination of the immaterial parts of our mom and our dad. And that position is called traducianism. Which we'll touch base on that position next week. But some, likely under the influence of the Greek philosophy, because remember how we talked about Apollinarianism, that the way he kind of understood, because he was very much influenced by the Platonic model of dualism, that there's a distinct soul, a distinct immaterial, and a distinct material aspect of a human. And so Apollinarius' idea of Jesus was that he had a physical body, yet he had a divine mind. That because from Plato's point of view, the mind, the logical soul or the mind resided in the head. He also thought the brain was just a blood filter. So it's definitely philosophical, not scientific, right? So there are some sorry, I lost my train of thought. So some under the influence of Greek philosophy thought that because souls are inherently immortal, that the soul is immortal, that it must also, they equated immortal with eternal. And that there was a third position that came about of a pre-existent, ants or ants? Ants. A pre-existence of the soul. So I think there was a little bit of a logical fallacy going on here. Would you agree that the soul is immortal? Does the soul continue on forever? Whether in life or death, right? Yes. So I think there's a logical fallacy here. Well, if it goes on forever in that direction, therefore it must go on forever in the other direction, right? So it's not really immortal. It's not only immortal, but it's eternal. So I think it's just a logical fallacy. But there's a position called pre-existence. And that position is pretty much all but gone, but it's pretty much out the door. So, but similar to the key word for Hebrew, for soul, also in Greek, the word that's typically used for soul is psuche. Yeah. And there. So, psuche. So that's where we get the term psyche from. Thus, the Platonic idea that the soul resides in the mind. Your mind is the soul that resides in your head, your psychological, your psyche. That's where we get psuche, the psyche, comes from the same term. but in the New Testament, we translate it as soul, but it can also be translated as life or person and used interchangeably with nephesh. Right? Now, I did not have the chance, but it's worth going back and checking. I didn't go back and look myself, but if we go to the Greek translation of the Old Testament and we go to places where we know nephesh was used, would we find the term psuke? And that's worth looking up, and I just didn't think about it until just now. Just to confirm that my assumption is that these are interchangeable. Are they in fact? We could go and confirm that assumption by looking at how this term is used in the Greek Old Testament translation. So we go that way. So similar to the key Hebrew word for soul, Greek most often is psuke and often means life or person. The exact relationship between the soul and the spirit has been a matter of some great debate, and there's good theologians on both sides of that argument. Some will hold that the term soul and spirit are absolutely interchangeable. It's just they are synonyms. They are two words saying the exact same thing. So you have soul, spirit, and body. Others will say that you have a body, a soul, and a spirit. And they will make it out to be that we're made up of three constituent parts. Not for this discussion. We'll wait till next month for that. Okay? And it won't really affect our discussion here. So, and some have argued for that thing. So let me ask you a handful of questions. When you think of the soul, and maybe these questions never come up for you, or maybe they have, but when you think of the soul, what is the origin of the soul? If I was to put you on the spot now, what would you say? How was your soul? How did you get your soul? What do y'all think? There's no wrong. We're not going to sharpshoot. It's just kind of where's your thought process at? If you were to kind of be put on the spot, say, I don't know, this one seems more likely than another, at least initially. What do y'all think? What do you think, bud? What is the nature of your soul?
When God created man,
Okay.
breathed the life of them,
Sure.
and that somehow made it a way to, like he created the soul when he created man.
Okay. But how did you create your soul? Is really what is my question.
Where'd your soul come from?
Where's the soul of Lee? The nephesh psuke of Lee. Now, like, what's its origin? How was it made? How did it come to being? You think, okay, I mean, and that's a fair argument. So the question is, did your soul already exist in some kind of waiting room and they get implanted into you? Or when you were conceived by mom and dad, somewhere along the way, God implanted a newly created soul into you that became you? Or is it that when mom and dad conceived, that not only was your body created, but also your soul out of mom and dad's soul? It's pretty much there's your A, B, or C options. Okay, so you more along this line initially? Okay, fair enough. Okay. Ladies, what do y'all think?
Not until last week did I ever hear anything.
Even think about it, right?
That thing.
Yeah, it's fair. It's fair. So the question comes to mind because this isn't something that comes up in normal conversation very often. It doesn't. So why are we discussing it? Is this an important conversation? And arguably, yes, because whichever position we choose here, we think has the strongest argument, that affects how we understand the nature of human as a whole, the nature of sin and the study of sin as a whole, and the process of salvation. It influences those understandings. And so it's a kind of a baseline building block into those other realms of theological practice. So it's worth the discussion. Is it something you're going to present to someone when you're sharing the gospel with them? Say, hey, by the way, are you a creationist or traducianist? They're going to go pound sand. I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And so, because this is for later. This is for a discussion later on as we continue to develop and do theological studies among us as believers in that discipleship process. But it does influence, our position will influence the way we look at the rest of our theology, right? Primarily, how depraved, oops, not that one, depraved, how depraved are we? And one will hold a different position than the other. Okay, that's not necessarily true, because there's some, it's going to be surprising, some people tend to be more creationists than others, and you would be surprised. I was surprised. So let's deal with the first one. I think this one will go the fastest. Pre-existence. So this sets pre-existence finds its foundation in Platonic in the Platonic idea of the human. So it's dealing with that idea that there's a distinction between the soul, the immaterial, and the material. So some of the ancient Greeks, primarily Plato and his idea of a dualistic nature, believed that the souls existed before conception. So all the souls were already there, and then when a child is conceived by mom and dad, then one of those souls gets picked at random and thrown into that body. All right? So you got a bunch of people sitting on the bench and say, I'm good, throw me in, coach. And they get to go play. The early church theologian Origen, now Origen is a special case. Origen is a special case. There's several things that Origen was very helpful for us for, and there were several things that Origen is like, dude, you're just absolutely off your rocker. Origen held to a pre-existence. Of all those that are considered orthodox, save Origen, he was the only one that held to this position. All right, so Origen, around 184 to 254, 2nd century going into 3rd century, he taught that God originally created a fixed number of spirits, a fixed number of souls, some of which were joined to material bodies becoming human. So his argument was that in God's sovereignty over all creation, knowing how many humans would be born throughout the ages, that in the act of creation, he created a fixed number of souls for all the humans that would be born. It's a very high view of God's sovereign act of creation. I will give a high five to Origen for that, right? It also says that God absolutely knows all of history, and that God is outside of history looking into history, right? So I mean, to him and from his position, it tends to make sense, but he's definitely coming from that Greek philosophical worldview. So he's trying to work through his own lens. And especially for me as an American, I love my autonomy. I love to be individualistic. Like, really, we love the term, you're not the boss of me, right? And so I am my own boss. I am the captain of my own soul. Blast me. But that is part of our American nature, that we like to get our way. And I found that most poignant when someone else pointed out to me, and of all things, it was an Australian chaplain on my last deployment. Because on my last deployment, it was right in the midst of COVID popping out. I was in Jalalabad in March 2020 when COVID just all of a sudden came to the scene. We moved into a place called HKaya. And when I got there, I learned that the building that we used for chapel services is next door to the hospital, and the hospital, without telling anyone, just took it over and put a bunch of beds in there because they thought half the base was going to die. And so, but they didn't even talk to any of the chaplains. There was a British chaplain and an Australian chaplain already there. This happened the week prior to me arriving, and they go, "Hey, I know you think you're going to try and fight this." This is the Australian chaplain talking to me. "I know you think you're going to try and fight this, but it is what it is. We just have to deal with something different." And I go, "No, we need to go, no, this isn't right." And he was right. He says, "But I know you're an American, and you're just going to go and fight this." And he literally said that. He says, "As an American, you're just going to fight this because you want your way. But you're not going to get your way." He was right. I did not get my way. But in the end, it was a messed up situation altogether. In the end, you know how many people died on HKaya from COVID? 0. And the very space that they took away from the chaplains to operate in, they actually, when a team or a command team got ill and they started transmitting and sharing among themselves, they put them into that building so they can continue to work, but then they were isolated. I was like, "You guys," I came away from that one quite angry. So, all that to say, we have to work through our lenses and know what our cultural lenses, our cultural preconceptions are, so that we can come to the scriptures and have them speak to us as God intended them to be spoken to us. In the end, I think what we need is that Hebraic lens to understand it from that Hebrew point of view. So the more we can understand the nature of the Hebrew life and the Hebrew worldview, that gives us insight to understand the Old Testament, and I would argue even the New Testament, because the primary teachers that conveyed the faith of Christ were Paul, Peter, James. They were all Hebrews. They were all Israelites, and so it's their worldview we have to deal with. So this idea of pre-existence. Let's continue on here. So the classical, so they were joined together in material bodies. So who else holds? Actually, there's a couple of people that hold to this pre-existence idea. I misspoke. First, the classical teaching of Islam is a pre-existence of souls. Oddly enough. So where did it go? I had that over here. I found an interview with a senior theologian of Islam. Did I close? No, I didn't. I did close it, darn it. And he said, yeah, he said, yes, the Hadith has a classical teaching that all these souls are created. They're basically sitting in the waiting room, and they get plugged into a human body somewhere around day 40 after conception. Why that day? I don't know. But that's the classical teaching. As you read through this transcript of the interview, you think that, I get the feeling that he's not necessarily convinced of that position, but he says, yes, this is the classical teaching of Islam and the teachers that have come before. I was like, okay. So Islam would hold to that. Why? But why is it not important to them? Islam is very simple in the sense. When was Islam founded? When did Muhammad found Islam? About what century? Say again? A little bit later. But it's fair. You know what's after Christianity? So 631, the 7th century, right? So 631 is the founding year of Islam per the Study of Islam's website. And their theology is quite simple. Now, do they have theologians that do the minutiae and kind of do and work through all the nitnoy stuff like those in Christendom do? They do, but it's a fairly new aspect of their practice. There's not, because in the end, a Muslim, although Islam is founded in the Middle East, right, Saudi Arabia arena, it was spread to southern Russia, into southeastern Europe, out to China, around the Mediterranean, across northern Africa, and back into southern Europe, coming up through France and into coming through Spain and into France, right? And so, and those are all distinct cultures, true? But so how did Islam survive in those things with all these various viewpoints? Because in the end, they really don't care about your cultural viewpoint. They care, do you hold to the 5 pillars? And the 5 pillars are very simple. One is the Shahada, the faith. Can you express faith in God and his, what they say, his holy messenger, Muhammad, as the greatest of the prophets? Can you express faith in that and you're good? Then you're good with them so far. And it's as simple as that. The second is prayer. So it's an expression of faith, and the rest are acts. They're actions. Do you do the act of prayer? There are 5 prayer. Muslims will pray 5 times a day throughout the 24-hour period. And they determine that, and it's all based on, they all have to face back towards Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia. And depending on where you're at in the world and where the sun and the moon is in its cycle, it determines what time of the day that you do this prayer. It's very, very, very legalistic. So, but there's a ritual prayer that must be required 5 times a day, and it's called the Salah, or the Salah, and it's just a prayer. And then you have zakat. Zakat is almsgiving. Do you give a portion of your wealth to those who are in greater need than yourself? Right. So that's honorable. And the fourth one, is Saum, S-A-W-M, Saum. It's fasting. And it's the act of fasting specifically during the month of Ramadan. You don't eat during the daylight hours. You can eat a meal after sunset, but then you don't eat during the daylight hours. And it lasts for 30 days for the duration of that month. And there's a massive feast at the back end called Iftar, and it is a gut buster of a feast, right? And then you have, lastly, the act of the Hajj. It's the pilgrimage that you're supposed to complete. Specifically says it's a sacred pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, required of every Muslim at least once in their lifetime, if it's within their means. So there's a little bit of caveat at the back end. If it's within your means. So those are the poorest of the poor. If they don't do it, it's not a deal breaker. But that's all there is to Islam. Can you hold to those 5 pillars? And they're so simple, they're so simplistic that they're culturally transferable. Make sense? So, but Islam, that's why there's not been a whole lot of investiture in study. It's like they left it the way Muhammad did and just kind of left it alone. And so there's not a whole lot of investiture in developing that theology of it. Whereas why we believe and what we believe, even as far back as Abraham, has been inherent to the Judeo-Christian faith. We have always asked why we believe what we believe. And that God has innately put those questions into us. So what's another group? The LDS also hold to a pre-existence. I'm going to stinking run out of time. Blasted. The LDS also hold it. In their book, oh, that's the wrong slide. Here it is. Okay, their book of Abraham. Abraham, along with, so you got the books of Moses, Abraham, Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith on Matthew, and Joseph Smith on history, and the articles of faith. This all comes from their book called The Pearl of Great Price. So in one of their apocryphal writings, Abraham chapter 3 verses 22 to 25, all you need to do is just Abraham 3, 22 to 25. You'll find us, bring it up in any browser. You'll go to one of their websites. Just make sure it's an LDS website. It'll show it to you. But 22 through 25 reads like this. Now the Lord had shown unto me, Abraham, so this is Abraham speaking, the intelligences. The intelligences is a substitute for the souls. So God showed to Abraham this collection of souls, these beings, these intelligences that were organized before the world was. Among all these were the many of the noble and the great ones. And God saw these souls, they were good, and he stood in the midst of them, and he said, these I will make all my rulers. For he stood among those that were spirits. He saw that they were good, and he said unto them, Abraham, thou art one of them, and thou wast chosen before thou wast born. And there stood one among them that was like unto God. This is their idea of the pre-existent Christ. And he said to them, those who were with him, we will go down, for there is space there, talking about the earth. And we will take these materials, and we will make an earth whereon these intelligences may dwell. And we will prove them herewith to see if they will do all the things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. So the traditional position of the LDS Mormon position is that there's a pre-existence of souls that exist that are then also implanted into humans that are born from their own literature. So they hold to this idea of pre-existence birth. So this view, however, has, in our accepted canon, Genesis to Revelation, there's no evidence for this whatsoever. There's no text that even hints at supporting to this position. We can't make an argument for a position from silence and hold it dogmatically. So there's not even a hint from Genesis to Revelation that this is in fact the case. And so this has no big support and accepted, and has been rightly rejected by all Orthodox Christianity, with the exception of Origen. Origen was not excommunicated. There's not a council that kicked Origen out, especially in his lifetime. It's arguable later, but rather his teachings were condemned, and his name was anathematized, cursed, by the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. And that first canon from that document, as the writings from that council in 553, the first canon is written right here on page 2. It says, if anyone asserts the fabulous preexistence of souls, and shall assert the monstrous restoration which follows from it, let him be anathema. So that council, well after Origen died, because Origen died when? 254. This happened in 553, so we're looking 300 years later. They said Origen was wrong. And if you hold to his position in this regard, you're also wrong. Okay. So that's pre-existence. And that's just there's nothing in Orthodox Christianity that will hold to that position. But Orthodox people will hold to one of these two. So let's deal briefly with the idea of creationism. Creation can be understood in two distinct contexts, cosmologically and anthropologically. When I use the term cosmological or cosmos, what do you think I mean? Big picture, everything that there is, right? Order of the universe. What about anthropologically or anthropological? It's just humans in general, right? So in short, if we're dealing with an idea of cosmological understanding of creationism, that is the Orthodox biblical view that God created the world. In the beginning, God created. God spoke. That God created the world. So that is not what we're going to discuss in this. It's rather the anthropological position, the perspective. The anthropological position, the viewpoint that creationism asserts that God creates an individual soul out of nothing, ex nihilo, and implants it into a body formed through the normal parental procreation. So as the body is formed from mom and dad, God implants a brand new created soul, psyche or nephesh, into that child. Accordingly, souls are uniquely created by God between conception and birth, somewhere in that gestation period, rather than being the product of the parent themselves. Support for creationism is attested by several key figures in Christian history: Jerome, Thomas Aquinas, and John Calvin. Here's a caveat on John Calvin. He chose not to, in his writings, and he chose not to take a position one way or the other, but he definitely leaned towards, in his writing, he leaned towards the creationist aspect. Whereas the other reformer, Luther, was definitely a traducianist and attested to it heartily. We're going to run out of time, y'all. Okay, Genesis 2. Let's turn back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 briefly. Hopefully you're still there. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 states that God created Adam's soul and joined it together. What does chapter 2, verse 7 say specifically? Then the Lord formed the man of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Was Adam a living creature before he had a soul? No. He breathed the breath of life into him, and he became a living creature. That breath of life is we're understanding that is the implantation of the soul into Adam. Thus, he became a living creature. So, the arguments for creationism is that God created Adam's soul, and we are products of Adam. So, our creation, so the logic the creationists would argue is that if Adam was created in such a way, we are also human, we should be created in the same manner. But did God give Adam his soul? Yes, this is a true statement. Oddly, there is no description on the nature of Eve's soul. It just said Eve was created from the rib of Adam and then presented to Adam. Here's your wife. I shall call her woman, for she comes from man.
It doesn't mean that women don't have souls.
No, that's not what I'm arguing. No, soulless women. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. No. But the scriptures are silent on the nature of Eve's soul, right? So we just don't, there's nothing there. If I go from this kind of this traducianist aspect, in that if Adam, just as much of his body is him, his immaterial in his soul is just as much of him, and in the removal of that rib, that to create Eve was a portion of his soul imbued into that rib that also created Eve's soul, and then the rest of her was taken from that. That would be more the traducianist view. If as a creationist view, although the scriptures are silent, then from the material he formed the rest of Eve and then implanted a soul in her and then presented her to Adam. But the scriptures are silent on the nature of Eve's soul. How was Eve given the breath of life? We just don't know. There's silence there. We just can't say. So we can't make an argument one way or the other based on Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. Because here's some questions. When we turn to verses 1 through 3 of the same chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And here's where I'll let you get some space for some notes. So Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host in them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work he had done in creation. The traditionist would say that God rested from the creationist would say that God rested from his work for a time, that he's still actively creating today. That's what the creationists would say. Yet, the scriptures seem to say that God rested from his work of creation. Full stop. And then nowhere else in scripture does it say that God created a specific soul for a specific person. Now, there's some arguments there, and the creationists do have some good arguments that unfortunately we will not get to today. We're going to run out of time. And so we'll have to pick up next time. So it is true. So that really, if we're looking at Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, we have to ask two questions. Was his rest for a time, or was a complete rest from his creative work? And we just have to ask those two questions, and we have to build a case for one side or the other. Correct. Is he modeling the aspect of rest and taking a Sabbath, right? Because that would go into the rest of the Decalogue to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? So let's stay in Genesis, but turn to chapter 4. Yeah. Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Now, it's arguable. What does that help? We have to understand, what does the term help mean? Is it, like in Psalm 139, before anyone knew you, or the idea that I knew you before and that I knit you in your mother's womb, right? Active work or sustainment of God. And if we go to Colossians chapter 1, and we see that everything that is in existence exists and is held together by the work of Christ, is that just a sustaining work, or is it an active work of continual creation from one generation to the next? They're fair questions to ask. Either way, Adam and Eve received help from the Lord to have their children. Question is that help the implantation of the soul, or just the natural? It's worth questioning. So, are out of time. We'll pick briefly